This week on the Communicators, a look at the Federal Communications Commission has two new commissioners prepared to join the agency that regulates communications by radio, television, phones, satellite, and cable, and that oversees aspects of the Internet.
Well, for the first time in nearly a year, the Federal Communications Commission will have a full complement of commissioners. Ajit Pai and Jessica Rosenworcel were finally confirmed by the Senate this week. Their nomination hearing was held last November. The chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, Senator J. Rockefeller, had this to say.
These are huge nominations, and they have vast effect on the future of our country, for better or for worse. I think it's hard to overstate the importance of the Federal Communications Commission and its reach.
Well, here to discuss the nominations and the confirmations of the two new FCC commissioners are two very well-known technology reporters, Cecilia Kong with the Washington Post, Amy Schatz with the Wall Street Journal. Amy Schatz, Senator Rockefeller seemed to hit this really hard, that this was very important, and that these nominations were important. What was his goal with that?
Well, Jessica has worked for him for the past 5 years, so I think he had a sort of a vested interest in this in a way that most Senate Commerce Committee chairmen really don't. But really what you're looking at here is that they really want to have 5 people that commission, because it's a lot harder for that place to find consensus on things when you've only got 3 bodies there. And so when you're looking at doing mergers or anything like that, you'd like to have 5 people in there. And so this is something that's kind of been holding on for a while, and they were very excited to finally to get through this week.
Cecilia Kong, what do we know about Jessica Rosenworcel?
Well, we know quite a bit in the sense that, well, we've seen her actually for 5 years, as Amy mentioned, sitting behind the senator in many hearings and many meetings on the Hill. She is, as is her colleague-to-be, Ajit Pai, they're veteran FCC actually officials. They've worked at the FCC before. They're also veterans of the industry. They know tech policy inside and out. And so they're not coming, they're coming with very thick and padded pedigrees when it comes to this subject matter. And what's interesting about them is they're coming at a time when the FCC is going through tremendous transformation. Actually, the communications industry is going through tremendous transformation from legacy technologies like just the plain old phone and DSL internet to broadband internet and wireless, and that's sort of the future. And in many ways, these two nominees represent this generation that's really lived it more so than maybe other members in the past. And so they're coming not only with expertise, but from being kind of straddling this generation that's also living the transition of legacy to broadband internet.
Amy Schatz, Ajit Pai worked for Senator Brownback. They both worked in the Senate. Is that significant?
Sure. I think one of the things that's different about Ajit compared to Jessica is that he has a slightly broader resume, because Jessica had worked for Chairman Rockefeller for the last 5 years. Before that, she spent 8 years at the FCC in various roles. I mean, Ajit had a much bigger resume in that he'd worked at more places. He's been at Jenner & Block doing litigation, I think, for the last couple of years, because he couldn't do anything more. He was waiting to get confirmed. But he was also a deputy general counsel at the FCC under 2 chairmen, both a Republican and a Democrat, and had worked in a couple different committees over on the Hill. So he brings slightly, I think, broader experience than perhaps Commissioner Rosenworcel will, in that he had more intellectual property experience perhaps and some others. So it'll be an interesting mix. But Cecilia's right. They're both actually very young, both early 40s, I think maybe 40. Mm-hmm. And it'll be interesting to see how they interact. Nomination
hearings were held last November. Why has it been so long? Remind us why we're now here in May talking about their being processed.
Well, these two nominees, Ajit Pai and Jessica Rosenworcel, got caught up actually in an issue that did not even involve them specifically. It was an investigation that another senator, Senator Charles Grassley, has been pursuing with the FCC, trying to understand its decisions on licensing and waivers and different permissions that it's given the satellite venture LightSquared. So Senator Grassley's been investigating this, and he has felt that the FCC was not cooperative in handing over documents related to his investigation. And so to keep pressure on the FCC, he threatened to withhold his vote. So essentially holding up the nominations from going through the nominees from going through the process of being actually confirmed and heading into the agency. So the two essentially got caught up in politics.
How does that affect the work of the FCC? They've had 3 commissioners now for several months. Michael Kopp's leaving in January, et cetera.
Well, they don't seem to have done very much in the last few months, and I'm not sure if that has anything to do with the fact that they were down 2 bodies, or just has more to do with the fact that they don't have a particularly ambitious agenda right now. But it's certainly something that everybody wants to see 5 commissioners over at the agency. They like to have more people there in the room. They like to have more people to bounce ideas off of. And when you're dealing with mergers, you like to have different people bringing in different perspectives when you're talking about conditions and things like that. And so it's something that the industry definitely wanted to have these 2 get through the process. And at that confirmation hearing, there weren't a lot of real objections raised to either of the nominees.
They seemed very well supported.
They were.
That said, Amy brings up a good point, is that there has not been a lot of activity at the FCC. Probably the biggest agenda item will be the incentive auctions going forward for more wireless spectrum. But this is also an election year, and they could, even though there's a full commission now, you may not necessarily see a jump start really at the agency when Pai and Rosenworcel join. So going forward, and also at the end of the election, who knows whether there'll be more shakeup at the FCC. We very well could see transition at the very top as well. So for the time being, there may not be major changes really at the FCC in terms of the agenda, as well as really seeing much activity at all.
Well, Cecilia Kong mentioned incentive auctions, and Senator Olympia Snowe, who's a member of the Senate Commerce Committee, during the nomination hearing, asked about that.
One of the issues, of course, is incentive auctions. And obviously, I think that there's been a disproportionate reliance on incentive auctions to provide, and stand that the FCC believes it'll yield up to 24% of the 500 megahertz. On the other hand, that's just a very small amount of what's going to be required by 2020 in terms of the demand and the explosive growth in wireless broadband. So how best to develop these technological innovations? What should be done in order to establish a better approach than just relying on incentive auctions?
Thank you for the question. I know that you've done a lot of work on this, and I would say that we have a real demand for spectrum, but we would be foolish if all we did was rely on things like incentive auctions and the auctioning of spectrum. We have to start devoting our intelligence and our resources towards developing better technologies that use spectrum more efficiently, and also studying the topology of networks so that we can be more efficient with the networks we do have today.
But in what time frame should that happen?
It should happen immediately.
And can it happen immediately?
If confirmed, I can tell you that I would certainly make it a point of trying to do my best to do so.
Thank you. Mr. Pai.
Senator, I also think that if I were confirmed, I would urge the Commission to do whatever it could to create a regulatory framework that incentivizes that development as quickly as possible.
Amy Schatz.
Well, they're preaching to the choir if you're talking to the FCC, because they're all about incentive auctions these days, but not just incentive auctions, just any way to come up with more spectrum for the wireless industry. The problem that really both the new commissioners are going to face is that they don't really set the agenda at the FCC, and so they basically have to do and look at the issues that the chairman asked them to look at. So, there's only so much that they could do individually to push this forward, but it's certainly an issue that the agency is looking at.
Olympia Snowe, though, said she thinks there's too much reliance on incentive auctions.
And it seemed like at least Commissioner Rosenworcel agreed that there are so many other things to consider. I mean, there are a lot of different pieces to this sort of puzzle and trying to figure out how to get more spectrum out. One includes mergers as well. Verizon is trying to buy spectrum from cable companies, and this is on the heels of the FCC's pretty, audacious, if you will, decision to block another merger that was really big and create a lot of headlines. So there's going to be a lot of interest in how the commissioners, where they stand on that merger going in. I think that's probably one of the biggest issues that Wall Street's going to look at right away. And also, there's a lot of questions as to how successful incentive auctions themselves can be. If the terms are right for broadcasters, if they want to actually give up spectrum for auction. By the time that the incentive auctions are actually put into place, the chairman may not even be there anymore. He's the one that sort of designed this and architected this. Jessica Rosenworcel and Ajit Pai are going in, adopting a plan that they didn't conceive in many ways. Although Jessica Rosenworcel worked on this quite a bit, on the idea of incentive auctions and spectrum on the Hill. So there's a lot of questions as to how far this goes, these incentive plans, these incentive auction plans, how spectrum plans in general will pan out over the next couple of years, given what's predicted to be a lot of change.
Ms. Cecilia's right. It's going to take years for incentive auctions to move through. Any kind of auction planning takes a couple of years at the FCC. The last time they tried this, it was a couple of years too. And that wasn't anywhere near as complex as what you're talking about with incentive auctions. Already you've got broadcasters sort of hemming and hawing about whether they'll do this. The whole thing is going to be very, very complex. And she's right that we may not see a Chairman Janikowski for much longer, even if President Obama is reelected.
Now, you've both kind of alluded to that we might not see a Chairman Janikowski if President Obama is elected to a second term. Are we hearing things? Is there rumors going around?
Well, I think if you ask the chairman directly, and I think we both have, he will say that he plans to fulfill his full term. That said, if you look back in history, when there's transition, even if President Obama again is reelected, there's oftentimes sort of a changing of guards in a lot of the different positions and appointees that he's put forth in different agencies. So I think that's widely expected, and he'll be 4 years. Mm-hmm. So that's,
Amy Schatz, have we seen any leaning by these two nominees toward cable or wireless or broadcast or any kind of maybe a perceived bias?
I haven't. I don't think people really know as much about Ajit Pai, perhaps, as Jessica Rosenworcel. And even with Jessica, you're not really sure where she stands on issues and if it was her belief about an issue or if she was just being a good staffer and conveying the beliefs of her bosses, whether it was former Commissioner Mike Copps or it was Chairman Rockefeller. And so in some ways, they're both sort of a blank slate coming in. It's not obvious that they have any sort of bias either way. I mean, 10 years ago, Ajit Pai worked for Verizon for a few years, but he left, and after that, it's not real clear that they really do.
Were there any of the industries opposed to these two?
No, they were both widely supported.
Across the industries?
Both nominees, that's right. And I do think Amy makes a good point that Ajit Pai in particular has a broad private sector background. I believe I've heard this name. He worked for Verizon. I think he represented NCTA at one point, the national cable telecommunications industry. It'd be interesting to see if he has to recuse himself from certain positions. When he was at the FCC, he was advising the chairman at the time, I believe, on the XM Sirius merger. So he's worked in satellite as well in communications. So just because you work on an issue doesn't necessarily mean that you have a conflict, let's say, or that you have a particular bias. I think Amy makes a good point. Sometimes you're just being a good foot soldier in delivering the policy goals of whoever it is that you work for, the committee you work for, or the body or the private sector that you work for. So it'd be interesting. I think there's probably a few more questions as to the private sector experience that Ajit Pai brings to the commission, which will also be a new thing because there aren't a lot of commissioners who have worked in the private sector in the past and currently.
Well, Senator Jim DeMint is another member of the Commerce Committee, and another issue that the two new FCC commissioners will face is potential USF reform. Senator DeMint, at the hearing back in November, asked about that.
Do you think the FCC has the authority to expand the contribution base for Universal Service Fund to internet service providers?
Under the Communications Act, the Commission has authority to assess on interstate telecommunications services, but it has discretionary authority to also assess on telecommunications services, which are a component of information services, which could be described as broadband. So I think that is the state of the current statute, and I would certainly commit to abide by the statute.
So you think internet services fall under the telecommunications?
I think a portion of it could. I think at present the system is subsidized by interstate telecommunications services. I think the challenge going forward is making sure that the revenue base is strong enough to support the type of universal service reforms that the agency just adopted last month.
So you think FCC now has the authority to assess fees to internet service providers to fund the Universal Service Fund?
It has the authority under the statute to assess on telecommunications, not information services.
Okay. Can you really divide
So
an internet service provider that provides both? You were talking about assessing fees to part of their services and not to others.
I apologize, I'm getting fairly legal on you right
Yeah.
now, so why don't I just say more simply that the current system is supported by telecommunications services, long-distance services as we commonly know them.
Right.
I think the challenge going forward is making sure that we have a system that can support universal service in rural areas. I think that the agency is going to need to look at new systems like the ones that were proposed in the last administration that involve connections, and not necessarily internet or broadband services, but connections.
Connections. Mr. Pai, any thoughts on the subject?
Senator DeMint, I can scarcely improve upon my colleague's recitation of the legal context for this question, but I would say, of course, that the Commission, having recently released the Universal Service Order and indicated that it intends to look at the contribution mechanism next year, I do think the Commission should take a very close look at the nature of its statutory authority before assessing fees in the manner you suggest.
Cecilia Kong.
That was a jumble, wasn't it? It's and I think it points to, and not really the fault of the commissioners to be. It points to sort of this underlying question and tension, and that exists at the FCC, which is what's its role these days? What's its point and its purpose? It clearly has authority as the regulator of telephone services, of telecommunication services. But its role over broadband internet services is under question. And that's what created a firestorm over the last few years as to what is the FCC's ability to regulate either rates or, non-discrimination statutes or what have you on internet broadband providers. And there's big battles that have taken place, and they currently are. They're still in court over whether net neutrality, the big issue that seems so far and passé today, but it was just a couple years ago that was the hottest issue at the FCC. These issues won't go really away, I don't think. I think that as long as there's any sort of regulation over internet service providers, you'll have some parties that say the FCC doesn't have the ability to regulate those services, and then you'll have others that say they absolutely do, and then others still, public interest groups, for example, will say, let's try to settle this for once and for all and redefine who we are and rewrite our rules. So that's why, and that's sort of the tension going forward at the FCC as to, how it can carve out its agenda and execute its agenda when these really basic questions are still being debated as to what the role is of the FCC.
Anything to add to that, Amy Schaaf?
I think that was a great clip to sort of show the difference between the two commissioners too, and that
What was the difference?
Commissioner Rosenworcel definitely seemed to come down on the side that the FCC does have authority to increase the base of people who pay into USF. I'm not sure I understand where she was kind of going with some of that, but she sort of felt like under the law they have that authority to extend it to internet. Whereas Ajit Pai basically was taking more of the free market. I'm not sure the government should be getting into this approach, and it sort of shows that sort of ideological divide between them.
And where was Senator DeMint going with that question? I mean, did he have an agenda with that question?
I could be wrong. I don't think he necessarily wants USF contributions paid for by internet lines.
Mm-hmm. Senator Amy Klobuchar asked about competition and mergers.
What role do you think the FCC should play to ensure adequate competition in the communications market?
I think that increasingly we're going to see more and more intermodal competition, so making sure more wireless spectrum is available so that there can be more competition from wireless is a good place to start.
Okay. Want to add anything?
Senator, I would build upon that answer simply by saying that to the extent that the Commission can do so, it should make sure that the rules of the road don't differentiate between the particular technology that is used. I think a lot of times the Commission is dealing with regulations that apply to telecommunications carriers but not to cable providers, but not to wireless providers. And to the extent that those industries are competing in the same space, I think it's important to have technological neutrality with respect to the Commission's rules in order to ensure that everyone is competing on a level playing field.
Amy Schatz, what did we learn from that video?
It was something I think you saw throughout that hearing, was that Commissioner Rosenworcel had very defined, very well-articulated views on these issues, because she's been doing this for a long time, and she's very comfortable in front of the Senate Commerce Committee. And in a lot of ways, Commissioner Pai was sort of getting to draft off her in a lot of these issues, because there is actually quite sort of broad support amongst these commissioners, no matter what their party is, on some of these things, and that they feel like, the communications law hasn't really kept up with technology. They are struggling to figure out how to apply these old rules to new technologies, and that's something that both Republicans and Democrats can agree on.
Now, one thing, Cecilia Kong, that Ajit Pai said that I wanted to ask you about was he thought the rules of the road should apply uniformly across different technologies. Did I catch that correctly?
Yeah, and I wasn't sure exactly what he was referring to when if he had anything in mind, a particular order or a particular rule in mind by that. But I think that goes along more with the general spirit of his support for free markets and evenness and level playing fields. I think he's, by saying, one thing that you hear quite a bit from Republicans is by for example, deciding if certain big companies should not participate in an auction, let's say, that in that way you are inadvertently picking favorites in the private sector. I think that generally most Republicans would agree that it's better to let the market decide on these things. So I think it was more of a comment on the general free market sort of principles that he has. I don't know. I didn't get much from that particular comment.
What's another issue that the Commission and these two will be facing in the near future?
Well, I think spectrum auctions and sort of the deployment of that, it is going to be a long slog, as we talked about before, will be the biggest issue going forward. I think net neutrality will always percolate on the side as to what the authority is. I think there'll be questions over media ownership going forward as to what the FCC's ruling, I think, 2007, if that still stands, and if the current slate of commissioners would support trying to reestablish that rule. I think one issue that's very interesting going forward, and Commissioner Rosenworcel's own committee addressed this recently in a hearing, is the role of federal government in online video going forward, whether data caps, bandwidth restrictions by internet service providers should be regulated in any particular way if it feeds into its net neutrality rule. You have a lot of companies I should say a lot, but some companies like Netflix that's really lobbying and increasing their lobbying efforts to try to make sure that that companies like theirs don't get sort of caught or suppressed because of data caps imposed on the wireline or wireless side. So I think the whole role of internet service providers and the fight over the future of TV and online video is going to be really interesting going forward. I don't know exactly how they would address that, but I'm sure that's something that people will lobby around.
Amy Schatz, what other issues do you see out there?
I agree with Cecilia on all those issues. I think another one that I think is going to be fascinating to watch is the indecency issue, because we're still waiting for the Supreme Court to decide whether the FCC even has authority to police the airwaves for indecency. And in the meantime, we've had 6 or 7 years now of complaints that have been piling up over there because the FCC hasn't been able to act on them.
Why?
Because their legal authority had been challenged, and so the basis for what they were going to be doing had been just the foundation of it had been challenged by the broadcasters who were upset with former Chairman Kevin Martin and his reign of they consider terror in terms of all the fines that they would impose. And so we haven't really seen any indecency enforcement in several years now, and so we're expecting the court to rule any Monday now on that. And so that's going to be fascinating, particularly with Commissioner Rosenworcel, because both of her former bosses were very, very hardcore in their belief that the FCC should be very strict about how they enforced indecency rules. Commissioner Copps was really very strong on this, as is Chairman Rockefeller. And we really don't know how she comes down on some of that stuff. So I think that's going to be really fascinating.
And so Jessica Rosenworcel worked for Chairman Rockefeller and for Daniel Inouye, correct?
Yes.
Is that right? Senator Pat Toomey was at the hearing, and this was his question and the answer from the nominees.
December a year ago, the Commission adopted the Open Internet Order. It's currently the subject of litigation. I think it's before the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. In the event that the Commission loses that case, which is a possibility, of course, would you each comment on whether or not you would support the idea of reclassifying broadband as a telecommunication service under Title II of the Act?
As I noted earlier, the Commission has had a practice during the past decade of treating those services as information services pursuant to Title I. The Supreme Court upheld that approach. I think there's been a fair amount of reliance on it, but I think the ultimate decision will depend upon the findings of the D.C. Circuit, and I would certainly, as Commissioner, if confirmed, agree to abide by that.
Mr. Pai?
Senator, if I were fortunate to be confirmed, I would have some concerns about reclassification to the extent that the imposition of those types of common carrier regulations might dampen economic investment, the willingness to take risks, and that is something that ultimately might harm consumers. And so to that extent, I would be a little hesitant, especially if it came, as posed in your hypothetical, in the wake of two Court of Appeals decisions that the Commission lacked authority elsewhere to pursue that route.
Amy Schatz, what'd you hear?
That is the biggest issue, really, that they're facing next year, because we're not doing anything on net neutrality right now. We're still waiting for the D.C. Circuit to decide. But when they do, and if they come down and say that, like they did with Comcast in the last case involving Comcast, and basically throw out the FCC's rules, the FCC's in a real bind, because the whole basis of the rules are based on Title I. And if that gets tossed, the only way really they can do this, unless Congress gives them a new authority, is to look at going under Title II, which is horribly arcane, but I'm sure all the telecom attorneys in the audience understand this. But this brings a lot of other regulations on top of broadband providers that they don't want.
And Cecilia Kong, you mentioned earlier that this is an election year. Is anything going to happen? Does this have to happen?
Not necessarily, although I think you'll see a lot of private companies arguing, continuing to argue that the FCC does not have authority. The FCC won't take this up. I will say that one thing that's very interesting is Jessica's answer is not to say, I do not think we need to reclassify. She's saying, as things stand, I feel pretty good about how things are. But like Amy said, if Title I is tossed out, or the understanding of the FCC's authority under Title I, and the FCC were to have to decide, if they were to decide to try to reclassify under Title II, she's not saying that she disagrees necessarily. Ajit Pai is sort of saying that he does disagree, that he doesn't think that's the course to take. So her thinking aligns much more with the chairman's office, which is sort of wayful, back and forth. And they came up, it was just going back and forth. We do think we need to, we're not sure, we found a third way. It's unclear, and I think that's been strategic, actually, that on their behalf. They don't want to do something that controversial at this point.
I think too, though, the one thing you would say about Jessica, she's not a waffler. She definitely has very strong points of view on things, and on net neutrality, she has been, even when she was a staffer for Commissioner Copps, I remember back when they were doing the AT&T Bell South merger, she was one of the people behind the scenes who was really arguing to get a condition on net neutrality imposed on that merger. So this is one where I think she would be very strongly in the sort of the, if they have to go Title II, that she would at least explore that.
Final question. With 5 commissioners now on board again, how is this going to change the dynamic within the commission itself? They've had this small group of 3, Mignon Clyburn, Robert McDowell, and of course the chairman, Julius Janikowski. Now they're going to add 2 more staffs, more opinions, more meetings. Is this going to slow down the process?
I don't think so. I think you're just going to see a continuation of the point of views that come from the different parties. It's going to be Democrat dominated, and you're going to continue to see there are no outliers among the current commissioners, and the ones that are coming in don't particularly seem like they're outliers as well, and that they have strong opinions outside their parties. So I think you'll see a continuation of things. In terms of slowing things down, I think some might argue that things haven't been particularly fast now, so there's not much to slow. So no, I don't think you're going to see a lot of change.
I think Rob McDowell might feel a little less alone sometimes. He'll have friends that they can sort of be together on. I would imagine they're going to be a very sort of unified voting bloc. I think the interesting thing would be, you'll have the chairman and probably Commissioner Clyburn on one side, those two on the other. I think, Commissioner Rosenworcel is kind of in the middle and kind of the swing vote, and that kind of makes it interesting.
Amy Schatz, Wall Street Journal, Cecilia Kong, Washington Post. Thank you both for coming over and helping us to get to know these two nominees a little bit better, and they should be in office by the time this Communicators airs.